Silent Hill isn't exactly remembered for its combat system, often looked back on as janky 3D combat from an era where survival horror was still finding ground as a genre after the success of Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil. This is a perspective that has weight to it, but there are aspects that I believe are overlooked, probably because the game doesn't explain the controls very well. Even in the manual, it's a bit bare. The basic gist is that Silent Hill is a survival horror game where you fight monsters whilst navigating intricate levels and solving puzzles, similar to Resident Evil, which was the main inspiration. Resident Evil 1 and 2 were out by the time of release, and Resident Evil 3 would release later the same year. What differs it from RE is the mechanics themselves and the general focus of the game. A core pillar of Resident Evil is item and inventory management. You have a limited number of inventory slots for items you can carry at any given time, including weapons, health items, ammo, and key progression items. Most enemies are easy to kill, but they take resources to do so. Resources that could likely be better spent later on in the game. As such, the challenge and replayability of these titles comes from memorizing routes and item usage. The combat itself locks the player in place whilst they fire a weapon, making them deadly but greatly exposed. The decision-making comes down to choosing what weapon to best use and which enemy to best spend it on, as well as positioning to maximize the effectiveness and minimize damage. Silent Hill has this, but it's greatly simplified. In Silent Hill, you don't have an inventory limit. You can carry as many items as you want. Therefore, there's no decisions to make as to whether you want to carry an item or not, meaning that you can carry every weapon in the game at once with max ammo and health items. Now, Silent Hill does combat this by making enemies faster and more persistent than the average Resident Evil enemy. Plus, they have certain behaviors like grabbing the player and holding them in place whilst others attack them. Bosses are also faster and more aggressive on hard mode, in addition to dealing more damage and having more health. Thankfully, not so much more health that it becomes annoying to deal with. Enemies can still be reasonably dealt with, and enemies also respawn in areas frequently, especially on hard mode. The idea being that you don't have as many restrictions put on you as Resident Evil, but enemies are a bigger challenge. The player themselves, Harry Mason, also has way more movement options compared to a Resident Evil character. Whilst he does utilize the same tank controls, Harry can strafe around enemies in both a forwards and backwards motion, hop backwards to avoid incoming attacks, and can quick turn, which was done before Resident Evil did it, fun enough. He can also move whilst firing the pistol or the shotgun, whereas in Resident Evil, you are kept locked in place whilst firing or using melee weapons, up until 2012. The rifle locks you in place, but this is the exception, otherwise it would be overpowered, and it kind of still is. Harry also has a variety of melee weapons with different properties. The starting melee weapon is the knife, which sucks. Even Harry thinks so. It does very little damage, with the only advantage being that you can move and attack the enemy at the same time, meaning that you can retreat while still attacking. The hammer is a very powerful weapon, killing most enemies in 1 or 2 hits on hard mode. However, you are locked in place whilst using it. You can still aim it, but you can't move with it. The pipe is sort of an in-between of these two, where you can move whilst aiming the weapon, but during the attack you're locked in place. There's an axe later on in the game, which is basically just a better knife. It works the same way. The Resident Evil games never really did much with melee weapons, usually only having them as a last resort for no ammo, so to have Silent Hill going more in depth with it is interesting. Plus, there's different attack options with the weapons. Quick attacks just require you to tap the attack button and they come out quickly. They can usually be spammed for 2 or more hits. If you hold the attack button, then you perform a slower but more damaging single attack, and the attack properties differ with each weapon. Plus, it's not a one-size-fits-all for every enemy, because even though pretty much every enemy in the game can be beaten with melee, some can be difficult to do so, such as these child monsters. They aren't hard to kill, but will often go for grabs which damage you and leave you open to an attack from another. And considering that you mainly fight them in closed environments, the mobility options Harry has aren't put to great use against them, so oftentimes you will have to find a choke point and take them out from there. If you're using a gun, this can still pose a challenge as you have to deal with multiple of them at once. Thankfully, the game actually has a switching target system. If you press right or left on the D-pad whilst aiming, it switches the enemies in close proximity. There's also these flying enemies called the air screamers that are very hard to hit with melee, even with quite powerful weapons, or these sewer enemies which hide on the ceilings. So whilst you could beat these enemies with melee, it's more preferred to use firearms. There's also a mechanic with them and other enemies where they don't get stunned from being attacked but do slow down. So if multiple targets are approaching, then you have to strategically choose who to attack first. Also, even though they do grab a lot, this can be used to your advantage. With nurses, if you let them get close and then dodge their attack, they're left open for a hit from you. Especially if you're using the pipe or hammer because those things have range. The flying enemies can be dodged by going in a zigzag pattern, and then that leaves them exposed whilst they try to reposition and attack you. This is especially helpful because Silent Hill has a system in place where both the player and enemies take more damage whilst they are attacking, so the player is encouraged to take risks like this to deal with enemies more effectively. And on hard mode, there are more enemies grouped together, so using the level design to find choke points is more heavily encouraged and rewarded, whilst bad positioning and spacing is punished by grabs and constant attacks. This is also ignoring the camera system. A lot of games used pre-rendered backgrounds for the time, but Silent Hill went for fully rendered 3D environments. The game does use fixed camera perspectives occasionally to great effect for atmosphere, or unique framing of the scene, but generally the game is presented through this third-person camera system which follows Harry. The camera can be influenced as well. If you hold L2, then the player can move the camera around and focus it to Harry's back, allowing the player to reposition it for comfortability or to get a better view on things. There's even a secret extra option after beating the game called Self-View, where holding L2 now locks the camera to Harry's back, giving him an over-the-shoulder style view. In 1999, by the way. Way before it became popular. Now, to be fair, I think the reason this is a secret bonus unlock is because it's a bit unpolished graphically. There's many objects in the game that use backface culling for optimization because you would normally never see them from that angle, and so it's clear that this is not the intended way to play the game. However, mechanically it works just fine. I use it on occasion. That being said, I think a major issue with this game is the amount of pistol ammo it gives you and the open spaces. You can carry more pistol ammo in this game at any time than Call of Duty. The ammo counts for the weapons maxes out at 200, and for the pistol, I was almost always close to that, or at least above 100 most of the time, and all of the footage you see in this video, unless otherwise specified, was on hard mode. Shotgun and rifle rounds are a bit more scarce, but even then there's quite a bit as long as you're not killing everything you come across with them. Unless you're going for the 10-star rank, it's not particularly useful to do so. And second off, I am jumping a bit ahead here by talking about level design, but the open streets of Silent Hill make it very easy to avoid enemies due to Harry's movement options and the lack of situations where the player can get boxed in, as well as the numerous items they can find. Now, Team Silent were aware of this, it seems, so the enemies you encounter such as the Ear Screamer, Dogs, and the Romper are much quicker and cover more ground compared to the children, nurses, or sewer monsters which you normally only find in the school, hospital, sewers, or nowhere. So the team made enemies to specifically work with the two different types of level design, which is smart. But I don't think they went far enough. They are still very easy to run past and aren't persistent enough to pressure the player, and I have one possible solution to this problem. Projectiles. What if instead of the enemies having to catch up with you to pose any threat, they could attack you from range? The only enemies with projectiles in the game are bosses, so the game already has projectile attacks. So what if the Ear Screamer, in addition to kicking you in the head, could also spit acid at you or something? The attacks would still need to be dodgeable, of course, but it would mean that even if the player ran past the enemy, they would still need to consider an attack coming for them. That way enemies could still be persistent without being downright frustrated. Also keep in mind, I am overselling a lot of this game's mechanics, especially if you play on easy or normal, because you can just brute force your way through the game on those difficulties. Most of what I'm talking about doesn't apply to those, and I don't blame you, and I would even flat out agree with you if you played this game on easy or normal and thought it was really, really boring. Another big criticism I have, though, is that even though the combat system is decently thought out with good dynamics, it is really underdeveloped and could have gone further. After a while, the way you deal with enemies becomes very uniform, as opposed to each encounter offering unique tactics. For example, if you're fighting a nurse, just wait for her to come to you, dodge, and then attack. If there's multiple, then just find a choke point or bust out the shotgun. And considering that some level design gets reused, then it means a lot of these combat dynamics get reused. I think the levels could have had more unique setups for the enemies, as well as more unique enemy types with different attack styles, where the usual methods won't work, so the player needs to figure out something else. Or even just combining different enemy types together. I've mentioned this countless times, especially in recent videos, and I am kind of tired of repeating myself, but when you have multiple enemy types together, then the sky is the limit for what types of combat encounters you can create. Now, to be fair, whilst good 3D combat systems, especially in fighting games, did exist by this point, doing full-on 3D beat-em-up style combat was not super common by this point, so there wasn't as much reference material to draw from. Which actually makes me have more respect for Team Silent. In 1999, they managed to make a combat system that, whilst flawed and certainly lacking especially compared to combat systems in genres only a couple years later, does feature a lot of core dynamics to making an engaging combat system. They just needed more meat on their bones or more encounters and enemies that took advantage of it. What if Harry could grapple enemies with a specific input, or if an enemy goes for a grab, he could initiate a shove, which doesn't deal damage or maybe deals very little damage, but gives him breathing room. Maybe the weapon he uses could influence that too. You might say this would make Harry overpowered, but I think if you're going to make the enemies more deadly and persistent than Resident Evil, then yeah, why not? You would still keep the atmosphere of a deadly and oppressive world with enemies that are out to kill you, with dynamics that other survival horror games just don't have. I'm not expecting a full-on beat-em-up style combat system with attack strings where Harry Mason is doing suplexes or bicycle kicks. I don't even know if that really fits survival horror, to be honest. But I do think you can add in mechanics that, whilst simple in nature, lead to interesting interactions with the enemies and levels. As it is, it's super simplistic, like I said, and really, really could have done with a lot more work, but considering that there are survival horror games to this day that struggle to implement combat properly and are even arguably more janky than this game's, and they have way more reference material to work with today than Team Silent did back in 1999, then yeah, I'd say Team Silent did a respectable job in terms of developing a survival horror combat system. Exploration is a big part of survival horror, and Silent Hill features a lot of it. The town itself is shrouded in a freezing, snowy fog so thick that you can barely see a couple meters in front of you. As a result of wanting fully 3D environments, this put a strain on the PlayStation to render it all. So Team Silent came up with the creative solution to cover the entire game in snow so that the render distance could be small. During nighttime you can see the environments pop in, but this can be reasonably explained as Harry not seeing that far into the darkness. I believe it was a blessing in disguise. The snow allows this big map to still feel claustrophobic. You'll be running around before suddenly bumping into an enemy, or maybe you hear the radio go off telling you that something is nearby, but you can't see it. Spooky. The town has a grid-like layout, similar to somewhere like New York City, so it's pretty easy to figure out where to go, and if a road is destroyed, Harry will mark it for future reference. There's also plenty of health and ammo items as well as save points you can find by exploring, so the player is rewarded for doing so. Team Silent were also smart by making any buildings the player can enter have the door open to make it clear. The only times it isn't is when the player is told to go to a specific location, or if they've already been in a building so they would already know, or in one instance it's meant to be a secret. I do think the town exploration, whilst atmospheric, is the weakest part of the game's level design, mostly because the gameplay just comes down to walking in a straight line, taking occasional turns, and then checking the map every once in a while if you get lost. They don't go on for too long, thankfully, but combined with what I said earlier about enemies not being that persistent in the town, then it just leads to a lot of walking from area to area. Later parts of the game will straight up just skip the hike for you and place you right where you need to go, which is nice because Team Silent is considerate of the player's time and engagement with the game. And yes, I'm glad they do this because some of these areas would just be backtracking with nothing new to see. So yeah, you might as well skip to the next part. The first real part of exploration comes up when Harry is searching for his daughter and finds a clue hinting that she went to the school nearby, which he then marks. Another change from Resident Evil is that Harry updates his map in real time, making notes and crossing off which rooms are unlocked, locked, or cannot be opened. So there's not much memorizing needed on the player's part when exploring. If you try every road to get to the school, they are all destroyed. You can find a note, which talks about a doghouse on Levin Street, which allows you to gain access to the house, but the back door is locked, requiring 3 keys. Thankfully, the key locations are marked on the map. What follows is the player heading to all 3 locations and obtaining all 3 keys. However, I think the game drops the ball in this regard. You're just running to 3 different areas, picking up keys, and then returning. They maybe could have done something similar to the crest puzzle in Resident Evil, where each crest has a unique objective to complete in order to obtain it. That might have bogged down the pace of the game considering it's right at the start, and the next section in the school is where things get interesting anyway. When Harry arrives at the school, you can find 3 books which make references to different classrooms in the school and a time. Outside in the courtyard is a clock tower, and the time on the tower is connected to whatever area the player needs to go to. It's a sort of diegetic objective marker where the player needs to figure out what room the text is talking about, which isn't hard, and then find their way to that room. Meanwhile, child monsters roam the walls. Halls. Meanwhile, child monsters home. Why can't I say that? Roam. It's Rome. Wasn't built in a day. Meanwhile, child monsters roam the halls. Some doors can only be unlocked by the other side, which sort of acts like a checkpoint for backtracking. After solving puzzles, you get transported to the otherworld version of the school, which has a completely different look. Metal grating, rust, and blood. Hallways will be blocked, random objects and disturbing imagery in rooms, and yet the layout mostly remains intact despite these changes. It plays with the player's expectations, making them go through a level again with the same basic layout, but different obstacles and objectives encountered within. Interestingly, the Otherworld version is a lot more linear as you go through it mostly in a straight line, but due to the increased enemies and the small changes in layouts, I think it works adding a different challenge to the game, and it gets topped off with the split head boss, which isn't a very difficult boss, you mostly just walk backwards while shooting at him. After more running around, Harry arrives at the hospital. This time it goes into the Otherworld from the start. The goal is to obtain different steel plates for a poem puzzle. Since the player will have the shotgun by this point, they are more decked out for combat. Unlike the school though, there is no clear objective on where to go to obtain items. As such, the player will have to look everywhere until they find what they need. Anytime they enter a new room, they have to consider if they will be an enemy or an item they need, or both, which provides a different experience than the school's more directed approach. Though the hospital is smaller, so it's not as tedious to navigate. I said earlier I respect the different approach that Silent Hill takes towards survival horror, but I don't find it nearly as engaging as Resident Evil, because a lot of the dynamics that make Resident Evil an addicting gameplay experience just aren't present, and there isn't as much snowballing from good or bad decisions from the player. In Resident Evil, blowing all your health or ammo early on will hurt you in the long run. Doing the opposite will help you. And that is somewhat true in Silent Hill, but you're drenched in items and ammo, and the difficulty comes more so from the enemies than the item management. And that means there really isn't much meaningful decision making to exploration. Plus, enemies respawn in this game unlike in Resident Evil, so there's not much decision making when it comes to taking out enemies or not. If something comes your way, then kill it. Now, like I said, the combat being more fleshed out than Resident Evil does help out in this regard, but it means that exploration, whilst not bad, is heavily simplified. And it's an aspect I think this game could have majorly improved upon. Unfortunately, after the hospital is where we get to my least favourite part of the game. This run through the sewers and the amusement park. It's very linear, with little to no exploration whatsoever, and you just pretty much run in a straight line, aside from a side quest which leads to the good ending, which is cool, but most of the enemies are the ear screamers or the dogs, which can just easily be run past. There's no puzzles to solve. There's a couple boss fights here, with one where you obtain the rifle, there's a moth you fight on a rooftop, which looks really cool, and there's another one where you fight Sybil. However, most of these just come down to a pattern of dodge the boss's attack, shoot him, dodge the boss's attack, shoot him. It's not super engaging. It's not awful, but this stretch of the game is mostly just running from point A to point B and hitting some cutscenes. Especially on replays, this section is actually quite boring. None of the gameplay's strengths, such as the level design or puzzles or even the combat, really shine through here. Thankfully, right after here is where the game gets its best level, Nowhere. Nowhere combines sections of levels from different parts of the game in a nonsensical way to confuse the player, making navigation and memorization difficult, as well as not giving the player a map for this section and forcing them to try and memorize the map in their head. For example, the basement door doesn't lead to the basement, it leads to a school classroom, and there's a door on the second floor that, when passed through, now puts you on the first floor, despite there being no change in elevation. It's really weird, and I like it. Thankfully, it's not too obtuse, as there's clear objectives with doors locked that require keys, so you know what you should be on the lookout for. Combined with multiple enemies in rooms and invisible child monsters, it is the most challenging part of the game, and it also has the most puzzles. It's a very strong level to conclude the game on. Despite the more simplified exploration, it still leads to engaging goals and challenges for the player to take on as they progress through the game. I think the game has too many sections of the player just wandering from point to point, and it could have been cut down. I also think due to the game's more simplified approach to inventory and item management, it doesn't make exploration as engaging and there's not as many gameplay decisions to do during exploration. And I think this could have been expanded upon, both for the sake of pace and for the sake of density, so the player spends more of the runtime actually engaging with the game. One aspect I was surprised by when returning to this game was that I found the puzzles fairly easy. Now, to be fair, whilst I hadn't played the game for long enough that I forgot the solutions, I did remember the general concepts for some of them. So keep in mind that my perspective on them is somewhat tainted by the fact that I have played this game before. Even so, I'll do my best to critique them, but be warned, this is probably the area of the game I'm least qualified to talk about. There's 6 major puzzles in Silent Hill 1, the first being the piano puzzle in the school. This is needed to obtain the silver medallion to unlock the clock tower. You arrive in the music room and find a piano with broken keys that do not play, but some work fine. Next to it is a poem of A Tale of Birds Without a Voice, that describes the activities of different birds such as doves and crows. Pianos have white and black keys, so obviously this correlates. The goal is to take the poem and match the order of the silent keys to the birds and events described. It's not majorly difficult or head-scratching, but it's the first puzzle. There's a clear goal for the player from the get-go, so the puzzle more so comes from interpreting the sentence than trying to figure out what the game wants from you. The next puzzle is the valve puzzle, where you need to turn the valves in a specific way to open the path. Turning one of the valves will cause that side to turn twice and make the other side turn once, such as turning the left valve will make the left side turn twice and the right side once. I imagine most players will beat this by trial and error or just brute force. You can beat it by looking at the pillars and concluding where each one will end up after each turn, and that is the smart way to do it, of course. It's okay as far as puzzles go. The next one is later in the hospital, where you have to match a bunch of steel color plates to the door, There is a bit of a red herring with each plate having symbols on them, but the symbols don't matter. It's a color matching puzzle, where you need to match the colors to the order of the poem and the things it describes. 4 of them are already done for you, and for me, the problem is that the poem is too obvious for what you're supposed to place. Violets in the garden? Well, I mean, yeah, it's talking about purple. Lucky 4-leaf clover? Well, yeah, that's green, of course. Liquid flowing from a slashed wrist? Yeah, that's red. You get the idea. I think Team Silent could have made the wording a bit more vague and interpretive. Not to the point of nonsense, of course. Or maybe they could have just had more red herrings in the poem where 2 colors could potentially match and the player has to narrow it down, maybe by process of elimination. The final 3 puzzles are in nowhere, one being this puzzle that shows a bunch of illustrations with numbers below them. At the end of the room are 3 keypads with numbers and more illustrations. If you try to match the numbers to anything in the illustrations, you'll notice that the numbers are referring to the number of limbs each one has, so that's what you have to match the illustration to. Once again, this is very simple. There's not much critical thinking or interpretation needed, just basic observation. Another is the Grim Reaper's list, which has a list of names. Next to it is a keypad, but the game spells out the solution on this plaque here, where it says that the names are presented in order of age, so you just put the initials in order of age on the keypad. I initially thought you had to put the initials for the surnames as well, but no, you just put the forenames and it spells out alert. I think they should have just removed the plaque because whilst still a simple puzzle, at least a player would have to come to the conclusions by themselves that the age is what dictates the order and not the alphabet or something like that. They would still be aware of the list relating to the keypad by its location and that it's not numerical. And I think that's more than enough to go off of. Especially for a puzzle towards the end of the game, by this point the player's invested, they're not going to give up. And the final puzzle of the game is a light matching puzzle, where you match the patterns of light to the keypad. This is a puzzle for children. Put the square block in the square hole type stuff. Now, to be fair, you do need to obtain the camera first to get these patterns to appear, and the game doesn't tell you that you can use the camera on them. You need to come to that conclusion by yourself by reading the names of the paintings and realizing they have something to do with light. So using a camera flash creates that light. So yes, in order to obtain these answers, you do need to use some creative thinking. So this one gets a pass, I guess. Also keep in mind that some of these puzzles require items to solve them, so they do tie in with exploration, which is good because instead of these gameplay styles being completely separate, they coexist to make a more engaging experience. And since combat is also in this mix too, it creates a gameplay experience that is more than the sum of its parts. Listen, maybe it's just me looking back on these puzzles and knowing the answers and thinking they're rather easy or simple. When I first played this game, I do remember getting stumped by some of them. I am quite silly. I also have a problem where when it comes to puzzles, I usually believe the answer is more complicated than it ends up being, so I end up overthinking the puzzle's clues or logic before reaching that conclusion, and realizing it's not that deep. What I will say is that I think the puzzles in Silent Hill make for a nice break of pace and good objectives for the player to work towards, so regardless of whether you think they're easy or not, they work well with the game's structure and pace. I do think some of them could have had more vague logic or red herrings to throw players off and make for more challenging puzzles, but as a first attempt, it's quite amicable, and most ideas or solutions I would have on how to make the puzzles better were done in later games, so Team Silent only got better at this. So in that aspect, I respect Silent Hill 1's puzzles as a strong starting point for something that would become much greater. Being a horror game, the atmosphere plays a big part in immersing you into the experience, and Silent Hill does a better job than most games even today. The town being shrouded in snowy fog whilst the noises of monsters are heard amongst the weather manages to create a feeling of claustrophobia in an otherwise open environment. Opening a new room in the school only to hear groans from monsters in the distance that you might not be able to see is quite unnerving. And sometimes the game will just play random sounds to catch you off guard. The feeling of being the only one around in a town that should be populated but isn't adds to the loneliness and isolation. And when the town shifts into this industrial nightmare, it captures that essence of being trapped in a hostile environment where the geometry is just as much of an obstacle as the enemies. To see normal, everyday places such as schools, hospitals, or malls be morphed into something out of a fever dream can be quite startling. And since Silent Hill features the supernatural, it can play around with these ideas a lot. Masahiro Ito, who was the background designer and monster designer, was very much inspired by the works of Francis Bacon, who had his own way of distorting the world and people he portrayed. And Ito took this philosophy and applied it to the monsters. When designing the monsters, Ito said that he didn't want to go for the usual demonic look with them, and instead wanted them to look like mutated and twisted versions of other creatures such as dogs, children, nurses, or pterodactyls, turning what humans are accustomed to into monsters. Though, I don't know, personally I don't see pterodactyls on a daily basis. As such, you get monsters which embody the shape and characteristics of things you're familiar with, but they are morbid and trying to kill you, which I'd argue is more disturbing than just a generic-looking demon or a zombie or whatever. This is also a really good place to talk about the wonderful music by Akira Yamaoka. Whilst a talented composer beforehand, Silent Hill is where Yamaoka would become a legendary composer. Silent Hill's soundtrack is quite distinct from a lot of other horror soundtracks, with its focus on industrial instruments and distorted noises, which when combined with the rusted industrial look of the game, fits very well, almost as if Silent Hill is a haunted factory of sorts, with all of the weird machinery sounds amongst the ambience. Mr. Yamaoka cited Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails as his main inspiration. He also stated that an important part of the music was understanding when to use music and when to not use any at all, since it would eventually lose its luster if overdone, and sometimes dead silence works just as well, if not better. But it's not just creepy or unsettling music. Yamaoka also managed to create tracks that add a sense of unease and mystery. The main theme itself isn't something creepy or unsettling, it's an exciting one that promises an adventure for the player to go on. The game also features different ending themes depending on what ending the player gets, which adds a more personalized experience. Silent Hill's art direction, music, and atmosphere continues to influence games today and still manages to be distinct all these years later. It's a game that's hard not to be sucked in by when playing. Silent Hill fares pretty well with unlockable content and replayability. After beating the game, you unlock Self-View, and can adjust the bullet count to give you more ammo. You can also unlock the ability to use 2 extra weapons with the chainsaw and the rock drill. You obtain them by getting the gasoline tank after the school section. The chainsaw kinda sucks. You can move around whilst attacking, and it does damage just by holding it in front of you, but it's really awkward to use and doesn't do as much damage as you'd expect. The rock drill locks you in place, but it does enough damage to cancel out enemy attacks and pushes them back, so the drill is the better option. If you get the UFO joke ending, then you unlock the Hyper Blaster, which has unlimited ammo and is in your inventory at the start of the game, or if you use the KONAMI tie-in. How much damage it does depends on your rank from the previous playthrough. Normally it's the red Hyper Blaster, which does as much damage as the pistol. If you get a higher rank of around 8 stars, then it becomes a yellow blaster, which does as much damage as a single shotgun pellet. If you get a full 10-star rank, then it becomes green and does as much damage as a rifle shot. If you get both the good ending and the bad ending, you can find a katana in the house at the beginning, which does a lot of damage and moves Harry further than any other attack from a weapon. Unfortunately, the game doesn't feature an arrange mode, which changes enemy and item placement, or a battle game style mode, which I think would have added even more replay value. There is the ranking system, however, which ranks you based on what difficulty you played, how long you took, what ending you got, how many times you saved or continued, how many items you collected, and how many enemies you killed. Your shooting style also influences it. Missing shots heavily detracts from point score, but shooting from further away grants more points. It is quite challenging to play the game this way, as it requires full routing and memorization to get through. Also, pausing the game doesn't pause the timer. When you consider the game's release window and the age of the developers, this ranking system makes sense, as they grew up in the arcade era, and grading your performance like this is us. Due to the multiple endings and unlocks, it just further adds to the replayability of Silent Hill. Compared to other horror games of the time, Silent Hill's story is told unconventionally. A lot of cutscenes in this game consist of characters standing around and questioning the reality they're in, and a lot of key information is found in items and reading. In fact, if you just press New Game, you wake up as Harry Mason after a car crash with no explanation. It's only in the opening video where it's explained that he saw a girl in the road and swerved to avoid her. Afterwards, Harry's daughter Cheryl is missing and he searches for her until he comes to an alley and is attacked by monsters. Thankfully, it was all a dream and police officer Sybil Bennett took him to the nearest cafe. From this point onwards, Harry's main objective is to search the town for his daughter whilst experiencing nightmares beyond comprehension. He keeps seeing visions of the girl in the road and comes across a woman in the church named Dahlia Gillespie, who is this weird lady that seems to have some understanding of what's going on here but is very cryptic, and she seems to be leading Harry along. He also comes into contact with Lisa Garland at the hospital and Kaufman, who runs the place. Kaufman is obviously hiding something, but considering that he has a gun and is very blunt, he doesn't press for questions. Lisa is a nurse who is of course scared and confused by her predicament. By the end of the game, it's revealed that Gillespie was using Harry to trap the soul of her daughter, Alessa, which is the girl that he's been seeing visions of. Through a lot of reading, it's revealed that Gillespie is part of a satanic cult that was using her daughter as a vessel to bring God into existence. Silent Hill was built on an ancient burial ground that was said to be a portal to hell, or something like that, and the cult has been trying to utilize that power to their own ends. If you read into it, they believed that God would bring a utopia to the world.
Why are you doing this?
It's been a long 7 years. For the 7 years since that terrible day, Alessa has been kept alive, suffering a fate worse than death. Alessa has been trapped in an endless nightmare from which she never awakens. He has been nurtured by that nightmare, waiting for the day to be born. This is the day of reckoning, when all our sorrows will be washed away, when we return to the true paradise. My daughter will be the the Mother of God!
Alessa was born with supernatural powers, and Dahlia would try to indoctrinate her with the beliefs of the cult. Alessa rejected all of it, which led to abuse from her mother, such as beating her, locking her in the attic, or setting her on fire. She was also bullied in school. The cult tried using her as the womb to birth God, but the ritual went wrong and it split her soul in half, which led to the birth of Cheryl Mason, Harry Mason's daughter. She isn't his biological daughter, she's adopted. And she's the other half of Alessa's soul. Unfortunately, a few years later, Harry's wife Jodie passed away, which made him want to spend more time with his daughter. The game explains that Cheryl was subconsciously drawn to Silent Hill in an effort to reunite with Alessa and become one again, which is why Cheryl suggested to Harry that they take a vacation in Silent Hill. Almost all the monsters in the game are twisted versions of things from the fairy tale books that Alessa read, and it is a reflection of the pain she went through. In fact, the Lisa you encounter in the game isn't the real Lisa Garland. It's a manifestation of Alessa's memories of Lisa given consciousness. Lisa was the one who took care of and looked over Alessa during her stay at the hospital and was one of the only nice people to Alessa, which is why she can't leave the hospital and is doomed to a horrible fate.
I get it now. Why I'm still alive even though everyone else is dead. I'm not the only one who's still walking around. I'm the same as them. I just hadn't noticed it before.
She also suffered from a bad drug addiction to get through her activities as a nurse. Lisa was planning to leave the hospital after discovering that Kaufman was funding the cult's rituals and experiments in a drug trade. Throughout the game, there's references made to a drug trafficking business being under investigation in Silent Hill, and it's revealed that Kaufman and the cult were responsible. He was making money off it, so that was the only thing he cared about. He was aware of Alessa's suffering and still went along. Eventually, the cult no longer had a use for him once they managed to have Cheryl return to Silent Hill. Kaufman had a backup plan just in case, and he kept some of the algophotis drug, which expels demons. Throughout the game, he's trying to obtain some to fight back against the order that betrayed him. And the game technically has 5 endings, but it's practically 2 endings. There's the good plus, good, bad plus, bad, and UFO ending. In the bad ending, Harry confronts Gillespie at the end, who manages to rebirth Alessa after combining the 2 souls, and she gets killed by her. Harry then has a boss fight in which he kills Alessa. She then thanks her father for freeing her from this torment, and Harry collapses to the ground in heartbreak after killing his daughter. After the credits, the game shows a scene of Harry dead in his car at the beginning of the game, implying that the whole thing was a dream or nightmare he was having as he died. The good ending requires the player to do a side quest in which they save Kaufman and he obtains the algophotis, which he then uses on Alessa at the end of the game to expel the demon out of her. The game then has a final boss where Harry fights the demon. It pretty much works the same way as the Alessa fight. Afterwards, Harry goes to Alessa and she splits her soul in 2 again to give Harry a new child. As the town collapses, she uses what little power she has left to allow Harry to escape. It's bittersweet as the Cheryl that Harry knew is still gone, but he has the chance to start anew and free from the town. Kaufman also gets dragged down with Lisa, so she gets her revenge. The plus versions of the endings are the same endings but with Sybil Bennett. During the latter half of the game, Sybil becomes possessed and the player has to fight her. However, if they obtain some of the Algophotus liquid before and use it on her, they can expel the demon and save her. So the good plus ending is just the good ending, but Sybil is alive and makes it out with Harry, and the bad plus ending is where Sybil stays with Harry as the town engulfs them. Most first-time players will likely get the bad ending, but thankfully the game tells you what ending you get at the end. So if you weren't aware that there are multiple endings, it tells you to keep an eye out and explore the town further on playthroughs. It is also reasonably possible to get the good ending on the first time, since it pretty much just requires you to head into this bar and then do the side quest. As for Sybil, there's nothing explicitly telling you that you can save her, but if you already achieved the good ending, then you know what the Algophotus drug can do, and it isn't used any other time in the game. Plus, you get some extra background on Harry.
But, you know, Cheryl isn't my biological daughter. I actually haven't told her yet. She probably already knows anyway, though. We found her abandoned on the side of the highway. Nobody knew where she came from. We didn't have any kids of our own. My wife was sick, and it didn't look like she was getting any better. So we took Cheryl in.
So in that case...
there might be some connection between Cheryl and this town.
So what do you do now?
Cheryl is my daughter. I will save her no matter what.
On the surface, Silent Hill is a story of a father going through the worst nightmares imaginable to save his daughter, and as a result, I think Harry Mason, whilst bland, is a likable protagonist and you can easily get attached to him. Underneath, it's a game about a young girl's nightmares infecting the real world as a result of the trauma and abuse by her mother and the community which she was a part of. Nowadays, a lot of games do storytelling in a less direct way where players have to go through and find clues or story pieces and put it together, but it wasn't common for horror games back in 1999, and it leads to an engaging experience figuring out what's causing all this horrible mess and why. I do think the game could have been more direct on some things. Due to the surprising lack of cutscenes, and even then the cutscenes don't explain much, I imagine some players will be lost on what exactly happened in this game. But I think if you're willing to explore and piece the story together, then it's a good time. The voice acting, though, is about what you'd expect from a 1999 game. Metal Gear Solid released a few months prior, also published by Konami, and even included a demo for Silent Hill, fun fact. And that game, to this day, has quality voice work, so it's a shame this game didn't get the same treatment. Though funny enough, Harry is voiced by Michael Gwynn, who voices Dracula in Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I think the storytelling of Silent Hill is quite engaging, with the way information is presented to you and how thoughtfully the environments and enemies were designed with the game's themes of childhood and abuse, and how that affects one's outlook on the world. The sad part with Alessa is that despite everything her mother did, she just wanted to be with her as a normal family. It could have been easy for her to be a resentful, hateful person after all the suffering she went through, and she is somewhat resentful to the cult. But in both endings, her final moments are benevolent and thoughtful. Pain and suffering is what changed this town into a nightmare, but it didn't change Alessa. If there's any sort of message to take away from this game, it's that willpower and perseverance amongst horrific people and environments is a difficult and challenging task, but it's worthwhile. Not letting this be a legacy and not letting it pass on. It's easy to give in to pain and misery, especially when it's unfair, as it often is. But doing so is letting it win. Alessa bid with it for longer than any person should, and yet, she won in the end. And she had nothing to gain from doing so. At the end of the game, she was going to die along with Silent Hill, and yet, in the good ending, still went through the acts of saving Harry and giving him a child. She did it because it was the right thing to do. And there's some interesting twists with characters who you think are friendly but are really using you, like Gillespie, or the tragic fate of Lisa. Harry and Sybil are just normal people who got thrown into this situation caused by an awful and delusional cult, with harmful beliefs and businessmen involved. Overall, Silent Hill's storytelling is pretty engaging and thoughtful, and it's part of the game's lasting legacy. But now, it's time to undercut all of that with the UFO ending. So after you beat the game, you can find this stone, which can be used in certain areas and will cause UFOs to appear in the sky. When you use it in all the correct areas, then this ending plays.
Sorry. Let me ask you, have you seen a little girl around here? Short, black hair.
I actually have no words for this. I have no idea why this is in the game, but I love it. After everything I've said in this video, it shouldn't come as a surprise that, yes, I love Silent Hill. Looking back, I do think some parts are underdeveloped and not utilized as well as they could be, and for the most part, the game does play like a watered-down Resident Evil. But I do think there are unique qualities that this game possesses that makes it stand out all these years later, and I respect it as the starting point for what would later become one of my favorite series in gaming. Unfortunately, Silent Hill 1 is not available on any modern systems. It is a PlayStation 1 game, so it's very easy to emulate, but it's odd considering that Konami has done a decent job so far with preserving Metal Gear, but Silent Hill 1 has never been re-released after the PS1's initial release. And it's not as if there isn't demand for it. On places such as GOG, it's one of the most requested games for a PC release, and there's ROM or ISO sites out there that show the number of downloads for PS1 games, and it's usually always either at the top or near the top. You might say this is a niche audience compared to the general gaming market, and that much is true, but it still shows there's an audience for it. And there's a decently sized audience who like older horror games and go back to them. For example, when Capcom re-released the original Resident Evil trilogy on GOG, they weren't expecting it to do well. It exceeded their expectations so much that they are now putting more of their classic titles on GOG. And it's weird considering that Metal Gear Solid 1 got a PC port in 2000, but Silent Hill 1 was always stuck on PlayStation despite the rest of the series afterwards getting PC ports of varying quality, to be honest. Hopefully Konami has plans to re-release this game in the future along with the other titles.